This is like part of a series of events that is organized by the Center of Alternative Policy Solutions, and the center has been active throughout the previous period, like working on public policy issues and actually hosting a number of public events on issues that relate to economics and to political economy. And actually providing an area for discussion and engagement that has not been available of late in Egypt. So just like briefly on the center, the Center of Alternative Policy Solutions works on alternative policy solutions, as the name suggests, quite intuitively. And as I was saying, it has this like problem-oriented research that combines like empirical research that is informed by political economy and economics approaches with the theoretical and conceptual knowledge that is offered by these disciplines, yet with an eye for coming up with practical solutions and alternatives, because of course like the lack of alternatives is one of the like key problems that at least the whole world has been facing, but one of course that has been used like over and over in order to defend the status quo, regardless of how uncomfortable the status quo may be. So that's very briefly about the center. Our guest today is Dr. Cadiel Malik, who is a friend of mine and one who has contributed significantly to the development of the political economy of the Middle East, especially with his recent work on the political economy of the private sector in the Middle East and North Africa, something that has not received much attention throughout the past decades, as like most of the attention has been paid to like dynamics like regime type, like state. So not much focus has been actually put on the private sector. So Dr. Cadiel Malik is a Globe Fellow in the Economics of Muslim Societies at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and the University Research Lecturer in Development Economics at the University of Oxford. This is where he did his PhD. He's an empirical economist with a strong multidisciplinary orientation. And as I noted, like his work on the political economy of the private sector, and especially his interest in cronyism and the political economy of cronyism has received some considerable attention in recent times. So the plan is to just proceed with Dr. Cadiel's lecture, and hopefully after he will have been done with it, we can go into a Q&A session. So thank you very much, and now the floor is. Is there something to operate with? Oh yes, sure. Can we? Sure.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be back in Egypt, in Cairo, and in this wonderful university, this beautiful hall. I was here a couple of years back with Ishaq Diwan and Samir Atalla and others on a panel on very similar subjects. Working in the Middle East is both now part of my profession, but more so it's part of my passion, because it's a great opportunity to learn about a very important region, a region that is very dear to my heart, and that gives me a lot of food for thought. What I'm going to present today are some reflections, insights from a project that I've been working with Ishaq Diwan from Harvard and Isaac Atias from Sabancı University in Turkey. And this project, the beginnings of this project was really this remarkable moment not very far from where we are. This whole uprising in the Arab region particularly in Tunisia, but with the fall of Ben Ali also in Egypt. And it was felt at the time that, in a sense, many of these Arab uprisings were just not a resistance to the regimes, but also a rebuke to crony capitalist structures, to the tremendous concentration of economic and political power in many of the Arab countries. Understandably then, many of the images of the Arab Spring often entailed these figures who were close to the countries, to the regimes, and at the same time controlled the commanding heights of the economy. You had the Ben Alis in Tunisia, the Ahmed Ez in Egypt, you had the Rami Makhlouf in Syria, and most recently you had companies who faced public boycott in Morocco that seemed to be tied to the Moroccan political and royal elites. So the question about business and state, they are intermixed with each other. And of course, one way of thinking about this is to look at what do people think. Public perceptions of corruption in government versus public perceptions of corruption in the business are surprisingly convergent. Similar percentages of people, when asked, what is the extent of corruption in business and what is the extent of corruption in government, they're often the same, right? And that makes sense. If you were to talk to some of our older colleagues who've looked at the region from the perspective of Arab nationalists, right, whether in Cairo or Beirut or other great capitals of this world, they would say, yes, of course, because businessmen and rulers are the same thing in many parts of the world, but particularly in the Arab world, this logic has a familiar echo. Now, the problem with this kind of approach is that it's highly impressionistic. It offers a very generalized account of crony capitalist structures, right? And with the result that, there are studies in Middle Eastern studies, such as Stephen Haidman's volume on networks of privilege, which for the first time showed how as Arab economies liberalized, much of the economic opportunity was concentrated at the top. There were shady networks of influence that monopolized all economic opportunities. And economic reform did not lead to an independent private sector, but actually led to crony capitalist structures. While Stephen Haidman in his work opened a new window, a fascinating window into politics of private sector development, we don't have much evidence beyond generalized claims, right? We just have generalized claims about cronyism and its after effects, but we don't have specifics. One of the great things to have come out of the Arab Spring was the liberalization of data. And in at least two countries, Egypt and Tunisia, we had the beginnings of some data democratization. We had information on firms that were politically connected. We had information on firms' output, productivity, a lot of other indicators. So we could actually begin to ask concrete questions about what's the nature of cronyism in the MENA region. This is what this project does. In this project we gathered a number of researchers from all across the Arab world and Iran and Turkey and started asking questions about cronyism, its nature, the mechanisms used to favor politically connected actors, and its overall impact on the economy. So what I'm going to present today are the broad insights from this volume for this project, which is now coming out as a volume published by the Oxford University Press called Crony Capitalism in the Middle East, Business and Politics from Liberalization to the Arab Spring. Now, this project is largely empirically grounded. It combines fine-grained data on firms, qualitative data sets on firms and their political connections, combines them with other data sets, micro data sets on firms, which part of the economy they are, so that we get, for the first time, for the Arab region, a very refined understanding of the nature of cronyism, its sectoral presence, and its impact, overall impact on the economy. This is a hugely important effort because, of course, when you talk about crony capitalism, you get a full hall like this. It's a very politically charged subject. But as social scientists, we have to think about these issues in a highly objective way, right? Because of course, what I say or what we research in this area has huge political effects. It has huge ideological implications. But as social scientists, it's important for us to view these things in an objective manner and to construct new empirical evidence on these questions. So what I'm going to present today is a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, and I recognize that a lot of people in this hall may not be able to comprehend all what I say, so please feel free to raise your hand if you don't understand a plot or figure or something, clarification that you need. But the idea would be to leave with you the overall conclusions of this project, but also to leave with you the new questions that this project raises. Broadly speaking, I'm going to talk about four things. Firstly, I'm going to tell you what is the nature of these politically connected firms, which sectors do they operate, what is their size distribution, what mechanisms are used to reward these cronies across the MENA region, what is the impact of cronyism on firm performance or on the performance of these economies, and then I'm going to end, hopefully, with some broader reflections on how crony capitalism in the Middle East differs from the rest of the world. Because we know cronyism is everywhere. The overlap between business and politics is not unique to Middle East. A lot of other regions have similar crony capitalist structures. How is there something called the MENA specificity, the sense in which MENA is different? I'm going to talk about that and conclude with that. So let me first talk about the project, the nature of the project, what we did in this as part of this. As you would recognize, this was an unparalleled data effort, not just for the Middle East, but globally. There is no such volume that actually combines data in each chapter on politically connected firms and traces its impact on performance. And in each of these cases, we had a qualitative data on politically connected firms, because we need to think about which firms or which sectors are politically connected, and then combine that information with quantitative information about firms. How much they produce, how much they employ, how profitable they are, what are the factors on which their profitability depends, how much do they engage with the outside world, all sorts of firm characteristics. And then we want to see, are politically connected firms in any way different from the unconnected firms in the sectors in which they're populated? And oftentimes, this meant that we had to compile databases from a variety of sources, the World Bank enterprise surveys, the United Nations, industry censuses, right, where they're available, because in a lot of the Arab countries, we do not have highly fine-grained data on this subject. In terms of methods, we draw on an eclectic range of methods. So things that economists use or statisticians use, like regression analysis, or sociologists think about social network analysis, broader mapping of politics and business, which is based on the methodologies of political scientists. So we look at a lot of these different methodologies, and in order to identify its impact, we sometimes use in shocks. We should look at what is the impact of trade, major trade shock, that might allow us to distinguish the role of crony versus non-crony firms. Sometimes we rely on discrete events, right? But we do not claim that we have a causal relationship, that cronyism causes this. What we have are broad patterns that are empirically robust and consistent. So the first thing is, how do you classify a politically connected firm, right? And for that, there is a huge scholarly literature, particularly from Fakir in 2009, where he classifies a politically connected firm as a firm whose shareholder or top manager has a direct link with the political party or with the political office holder, or his relative has a direct connection. And much of this information clearly is qualitative. You need to know about, press reports, interviews with people. Oftentimes, crony capitalist structures are such that people know who are the big players involved, right? And so the information is there, it's just a matter of capturing that information. But of course the information is conservative, because in any empirical project, you need to think about clear and identifiable, empirically verifiable link between political connection of a firm and other outcomes. So the effects that we highlight are, if anything, likely to be stronger if we take into account the larger range of cronies. And of course, how we measure politically connected firms can differ across countries, because there are two contexts in our country studies, Iran and Turkey, where connections are less based on family relations, more on ideological affiliation. So in Iran, much of the private sector politics is around the role of semi-public organizations, the Bunyad-e-Mustafaza, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the Martyrs Foundation. These are big foundations that are rooted in Iran's underlying political economy, where rents are distributed to different social constituencies. And in Turkey, of course, political connections, again, are not based on family linkages. They're a lot more based on the emergent divide in Turkey between religiously affiliated firms that are part of big religious networks, which AK Party develops and builds on, and the more kind of secular networks. These were the older firms in Istanbul, Izmir, Ankara, these old industries. So this divide between the old secular and the new religious firms is what will help us define the role of politically connected firms. Okay, so what do we learn about where these firms are present? We are able to find that they have substantial presence in many of the MENA economies. When I talk about MENA, it's basically Middle East and North Africa. So you have about 385 firms in Egypt, 497 in Lebanon, 662 firms in Tunisia, and of course there are a lot of there's a big range around there. There are a lot of Moroccan holding companies that are owned by the king, and then ultimately they have control over various parts of the economy. And of course, the nature of this connection, as I've emphasized, varies. In many cases, these are firms that are connected with ruling political parties. The AK Party in Turkey, the NDP in Mubarak's Egypt, the RCD in Tunisia, that allows us to differentiate them back. In Morocco, for example, we have to look at companies that are owned by the king, but the Mahsan, the royal court, and then the politicians were often cabinet ministers. We also find that a lot of these firms, understandably so, are very large firms, large capital-intensive firms, established firms, in terms of size distribution of these firms. Apart from Turkey, we don't have any politically connected firm that is very small in size, or there might be a few medium scale, but you're really talking about firms that are large, organized around pyramidal structures, and they typically, apart from Turkey, have insignificant presence in the export-oriented sectors. They largely operate on the domestic economy, trying to slice the domestic pie. In terms of subsectors, again, you get a huge variation. So yes, indeed, there are sectors like food, products and beverages. You have a lot of presence. Motor vehicles, of course, because a lot of these big motor vehicle plants or companies that distribute, they are connected with leading families. Machinery and equipment in some cases, furniture. Again, these are the percentage of subsectors that are penetrated by cronies. So if you look at food products, about 50% of the all subsectors in Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt are dominated by cronies. So yes, there is a broader picture of cronyism here in manufacturing, but there is significant variation. And that's the main feature of this project, that it lends us greater empirical specificity and allows us to think about patterns of differentiation. Now, there is, of course, the extent of exposure differs. So you find Egypt has been far more exposed to crony firms Tunisia and Morocco only 40%, Lebanon 20%. And some of this extent of exposure, whether 50% of the sectors are exposed to cronies or 20%, as in Lebanon, is partly determined by the size of the country and partly determined by the scope of government intervention. If you think about Lebanon, the scope of government intervention is very limited. Now, of course, when you think about many of these crony firms, this is a plot that an image that became part of the Arab Spring coverage is about 220 firms that Laila Trabelsi and Zain al-Abidin Ben Ali owned. And many of those firms, as you could see, controlled, they were not part of what we call in Tunisia the offshore sector, the export-oriented sector. These are firms that try and stake their claim in the domestic services sector. So you think about banks, local TV production, some refining, yes, so some manufacturing, fishing, construction. You look at large parts of the economy where they had these stakes. And it's a bit like saying you basically put your hand in the most rent-thick sectors where through licenses or regulations you can create a lot of privilege for the cronies. And that in a sense is the global definition of cronyism, because cronyism is that sort of overlap between business and politics that allows firms to earn above market returns, which is to say, in the absence of political connections, those monopoly or above market returns would not be possible. And that's quite visible from here. I love this plot, which is on Egypt, on Morocco, but it's probably true for many countries. It tells us about how some of these crony firms evolved over time. So one of the great things about empirical work is that you can date the foundation of these firms. Because many of these firms that had shareholders that were connected to politicians, you could find when these firms were founded. And in many cases, particularly in Morocco, you find that over time there's a growing presence of cronies, both in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia. Over time, in the period of liberalization starting late 1990s, you see greater sectoral exposure to cronyism. But this sectoral exposure is particularly manifested in what economists call non-tradable sectors. Non-tradable sectors are real estate, banking, finance, domestic distribution of goods, right? So a lot of these services sectors were where you would see greater concentration of politically connected actors. And what's interesting is the way in which, post-1990s, you see a growing presence of politically connected firms in non-tradable sectors in Morocco compared to the tradable sectors. And as is clear that by 2013, the real estate sector had become the most crony-prone sector in Morocco. We also see a division of labor, whereby a lot of politicians and cabinet ministers in Morocco controlled the manufacturing sector, and some of the juiciest parts of the real estate and non-tradable sectors were controlled by the Moroccan monarchy. So you see an interesting division of labor where rents generated through control of the markets, and by rents I mean to say unearned income streams by virtue of because for real estate sector you need to know who controls land. And in many cases, the government is the largest controller of land. So if you can give a license to a firm to hold that land, give a title, you immediately create a huge above market return for that firm. And once that above market return is created, they could also access finance. Similarly, if you're thinking about telecoms, again, it's the services sector. All across the MENA region, whereas the Syriatel by Rami Makhlouf, other big telecom operators, they needed licenses to operate. And those licenses were not auctioned as part of a competitive process. They were given selectively by these different regimes to appease many of these actors. So this is a story that finds echo in a lot of MENA countries, indeed in a lot of developing countries where the real estate and non-tradable sector receives greater presence. In a sense, this also represents one of the great ironies of the process of globalization. Denny Roderick at Harvard talked about premature deindustrialization, which is to say that a lot of developing countries, rather than making a transition from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services, they actually bypass the manufacturing stage and they move from a primitive agricultural sector to more services. Now, in that transition, part of this story is the way in which there was greater crony representation in some of these services sector. In this book, we also talk about the different mechanisms used by cronies to get favor. We talk about the way in which subsidies are controlled and benefit particular kinds of firms. We talk about finance, privatized assets, which again from Jordan to Morocco, a lot of MENA countries, and indeed in Soviet Union too, we had assets passing from the government to those big actors. Regulatory capture, trade barriers, land allocation. So what I'm going to do is really zoom through these evidence, and each slide I will have a plot and a little description which gives you a broad flavor of what I'm arguing. This is from Ishaq Divan's chapter on Egypt, where he talked about how politically connected firms, those represented in blue, overwhelmingly operated in sectors that were energy intensive, that is, sectors that benefited from energy subsidies. So energy subsidies benefit a lot of politically connected firms, not just the final consumers. And in fact, the profitability of many of these firms is directly dependent on subsidies. This is an illustration from Mohammed Obinal's paper in Morocco, where he looked at interlocking board membership. So the idea is that you have members of a board, and they're also a member of another board, and then they're also a member of another board. And he talks about the way in which, if you look at the pattern of board memberships, you will realize that the same individuals who are close to the royal court are actually present on multiple boards. And indirectly, therefore, the king can control different parts of the economy by controlling finance. If you control finance, you control quite a large number of other sectors. And so this tells us about the centrality of finance, where the largest number of interlocking board members are present. And through that, you can, of course, control industry, construction, agribusiness, transport. And again, this gives you a sense in which the social science analysis, particularly new methods in sociology, could be used to uncover patterns that provide us new insights about the way in which politics and business intersect. We also have a paper by Jad Shaban on the Lebanese banking sector. Of course, you talk to anyone in the Arab world, they know that the Lebanese banking system is where politicians come together, they cooperate with each other, they compete in other domains, but they cooperate in the banking sector. And he talked about the way in which the shareholders of 18 out of 20 Lebanese banks were linked with political elites. And so in this plot, we talk about whether or not a person is directly involved in the bank and whether indirect shareholder. So significant control of the banking sector in Lebanon. In Turkey, again, finance is an important part of the story, where we have a paper by Saka and Birjan, where they talk about the dispersal of funds from state-controlled banks at the time of local elections. In the run-up to the local elections, they show that state-owned banks are more comfortable lending to firms that are linked with AK Party, with Erdogan's party. Okay, and they're much. The next is the swing region and the opposition core. And compared to these two regions, state-dominated lending. So in a sense, it provides us evidence, which is quite common in political science, of the co-movement of electoral and credit cycles. As countries, pass through elections, they give out more credit. We don't have a lot of evidence on the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, nor do we have a lot of evidence on countries where it is difficult to collect data, like Iraq and Syria and other places, but the patterns are fairly similar. We can discuss them in the Q&A session. But one factor that's quite prominent in the Gulf countries is that the government plays a dominating role in the capital markets. So larger role is twice as large globally in the Gulf countries, the governments and sovereign wealth funds' role in the capital markets. The role of institutional investors is also very limited. And of course, when it comes to government-owned banks and sovereign wealth funds, royal families, their kith and kin, the leading merchant and other families have an important role to play in controlling that. In Egypt, Ishaq Diwan and others showed that 92% of the total loans that were extended to the private sector went to the large firms. Okay, but the reasons sometimes are different, because it is possible that banks want to lend to firms that are more secure, that are growing, that are profitable, and if they fail, the government can support them. So it's not always the case that banks give credit to large firms simply because they're connected. It's just because sometimes banks realize that these are the ones that are more stable or secure to support. But altogether, it gives us some interesting aspect about the way in which control of finance becomes an important variable. On privatizations, we have very interesting evidence from Bob Reichers and others who talk about many of the Benelli firms that were essentially previously state-owned firms and came into hands of the Benelli family. And here they show that the profits of these Benelli privatized firms rose considerably compared to other privatized firms. So the privatization wasn't very successful, but where privatization led to greater profits, it was mainly in firms that were owned by the Benelli and clan, and it's partly because Benelli and clan ensured that there were regulations that would protect those privatized firms. But the story of privatization in Iran is extremely interesting and very different in many ways. Here again, the process of privatization was pseudo-privatization. In other words, firms did not necessarily pass from public hands to private hands, but actually they did not pass to families. They went from one arm of the state to another arm of the state. And nearly half of the total shares of the 331 companies that were put on sale in Iran during the late 1980s were basically acquired by semi-public organizations. And these are the organizations, the Bunyas, the Revolutionary Guards, the Martyrs Foundations. These are large foundations that are not public, but they're neither fully private. They're kind of quasi-private sector. And this gives us a sense in which this privatization tells us about the changing structures of institutional ownership, where you have greater diversification of ownership types. It's not just public versus private, but a lot of diversified conglomerates. And this is by no means exceptional. There are a lot of emerging market economies in Latin America and Africa which have dominant public sector organizations. In a sense, to understand the dominance of these organizations, you need to understand Iran's unique or distinct political economy that is marked by war, sanctions, and the need to cater to a broad social constituency. So a lot of these supporters of the Islamic Revolution in Iran would typically receive jobs or benefits through these organizations. So they serve a very distinct political purpose. Another instrument is trade policy, and this is some of the work that I have done on Morocco and Egypt. The left plot represents Egypt, the right plot represents Morocco. And before you get bogged down in the plots, what we did essentially, and what the big story is, that in both Egypt and Morocco, there was a process of trade liberalization that was triggered by the European Union as part of its Mediterranean initiative. And we show that in both of these cases, trade liberalization meant reduction in tariffs. But subsequently, it meant a rise in non-tariff measures. And non-tariff measures or non-tariff barriers are barriers that have effects that are similar to tariffs, but unlike tariffs where you say 70% tariff or 80%, non-tariff barriers are regulations like sanitary and phytosanitary requirements, labeling requirements, a lot of technical specifications on products that are imposed as part of the European Union regulation. What we show, and that in the crony sectors, the solid line, and the non-crony sectors in the dashed line. What we show is that prior to the European Union trade agreement, they had similar trajectory of non-tariff measures. But after the European Union agreement, when a lot of non-tariff measures were slapped, the connected sectors received a significantly higher proportion of non-tariff protection, which tells us that yes, even the externally induced trade reforms can be captured, even the process of economic reform can be captured by politically connected actors because they're placed at the right position. They can manage the process in a way that continues to give them substantial advantage. The story in Morocco is even more striking because here we are able to distinguish between sectors that are controlled by the Mahsen and sectors controlled by the politicians. And we find that post-EU trade agreement, it was mainly the sectors that were populated by politicians that received higher level of tariff protection, non-tariff protection. So if you look at this dashed line, this line represents all those sectors where the politicians are more active. And this tells us a way in which the regimes, in political science terms, the regimes when they're faced with compensation, they try to compensate different members of the ruling coalition through different instruments, right? And so, for example, for the king, it was mainly finance, real estate, those rent-thick sectors. For the cabinet ministers, who were often politicians, the compensation was in the form of trade policy. And you find very similar evidence, I'll tell you shortly, in Jordan too. But what does this technical barriers means? If you look at the distribution of technical barriers to trade, the sort of technical barriers that we emphasize, B84, B89, these are particular regulations. These are regulations that require authorization requirement, testing requirement, inspection requirement. These are clearly, if a sector is more protected by non-tariff measures, it requires greater administrative oversight. And of course, if you're politically connected, you will face less stringent testing procedures compared to unconnected actors. So again, a powerful way in which you can use data to tell what is happening in different parts of the economy. But to support the point that I'm already making about the nature of compensation, we have an interesting paper on Jordan, which again tells us the way in which trade policy in Jordan is a way to compensate the Palestinian private sector. Because as some of you might know, that in Jordan's political settlement is an ethnic political settlement, right? Where the East Bankers control the public sector and the Palestinian merchants control the private sector. So in the wake of liberalization, the regime compensates the two segments in different ways. The politically included co-ethnics, the East Bankers, are compensated through informal form of protection. It could be procurement contracts, regulatory enforcement. And to the private sector actors who are politically included, they're compensated through trade policy, through tariffs, regulatory barriers, and subsidies. So you get a very interesting perspective on the way in which even members within the same ruling coalition could be compensated through different instruments. It also begins to highlight that many of these crony capitalist structures are an important political requirement because the incomes or the rents they generate are important to sustain the ruling coalition. On procurement, you have a lot of evidence, and this one on Turkey tells you how the AK Party-dominated firms receive a lot more procurement contracts. In fact, all the politically connected firms, as a share of the total firms, were the ones that were receiving a lot of benefits. And this is very similar to Malaysia, for example, where again, in the construction sector, in procurement contracts, the politically connected firms receive. So it's by no means very unique to the region. But it tells you about the way in which on procurement you can have greater preference for these. Now, what does this mean for outcomes? How important is cronyism for thinking about development and growth? Well, a lot of these papers looked at the impact of cronyism on firm productivity, on growth, their ability to create jobs. And what you find is the clearest evidence comes from Ishaq Livan's paper on Egypt, where it shows that in 2010, Egyptian politically connected firms derived 60% of the net corporate profits, but generated only 11% of employment. So they were drawing on a lot of profits, but they were not depending on, not creating enough jobs. In the absence of cronyism, job creation in the formal economy, they show, could have been 25 percentage points higher. And in general, all those sectors where crony entered, the overall size distribution of firms was affected, which is to say that where cronies entered, firms were largely of bigger in size. There are a lot of small firms and a few large firms, and so you have a missing middle in between. Very similar evidence from Tunisia and Lebanon, because in Tunisia you see that connected firms represented only 0.1% of the total firm space in protected sectors, but created 10% of jobs, 3% of output, and 53% of net profit. So you're thinking about a firm space where crony firms are able to derive a lot of profits, but they're not generating enough jobs. In Lebanon, again, there is evidence that there is job creation is much lower. But with a difference. In Lebanon, most of the politically connected firms are required to create more jobs. So in aggregate, they create more jobs. But on a net basis, the job creation is much less. So what's the picture that's emerging? It's very initial picture, but it provides you a sense in which in some of the Middle Eastern countries, we find that privileges are concentrated amongst a few firms, and jobs are concentrated amongst a large number of informal sector firms. And that disconnect between the concentration of privileges among a few firms, the concentration of employment creation amongst a large number of small firms, is one of the truly important disjunction in modern political economy. Now, of course, the ability of some of these firms to be profitable directly depended on regulatory sectors. So here is a plot from Baghdadi et al.'s paper in Tunisia, where they look at the contribution of the Ben Ali firms as part of the total economy, and they find that overall it's the same sort of evidence that I've presented before. There is telling us that they are generating a lot of profits and relatively less output. But the important insight that Baghdadi et al. Tell us about is that a lot of the Ben Ali firms were concentrated in those sectors which were highly regulated. This is the evidence from Jordan. That said, I think when it comes to tracing the impact of cronyism on development, we know much less than we imagine. Of course, it's a topic that would appeal to a lot of people in the West where economic wealth is getting concentrated. It will appeal to a lot of people in this part of the world where there's similar concerns about cronyism. But how cronyism impacts development is a subject that requires a lot more empirical inquiry. And in fact, what we find is that cronyism can be consistent with a range of different outcomes. Although we do not have very specific, definitive evidence from Morocco, we do get a sense that in Morocco, economic growth is consistent with some form of cronyism. In Turkey, we have an entirely similar but very remarkable picture where, yes, there are politically connected firms. Yes, there are firms that benefit from procurement contracts. There are firms that are part of the religious affiliated business organizations that are supported by AK Party, and they in turn support AK Party. But we find that actually since the 2000s, the productivity gap between the old secular firms and the new religious firms has shrunk in a major way. So there's a productivity catch-up that is associated with these firms. And what's happening is that a lot of this productivity catch-up is attributable to the growth of these Anatolian firms that are connected with global markets. These are firms that are exporters. These are firms that are contributing to national production. And in general, we find, and here Turkey is so different from the rest of the MENA region, that a lot of these firms are small and medium enterprises. They're export-oriented, and they're small and medium enterprises. And that, in a sense, tells us why cronyism has been different in Turkey compared to the MENA region. Because in our part of the world, we have a lot of firms that are connected firms, that are large firms, and they do not participate in exports. But I think there is a broader, more general question about cronyism and its effect. And it relates to the politics of development, or the political economy of development, which is to say, cronyism is found everywhere. If you look at East Asia's development experience, you find the rise of chaebols in South Korea, the growth of crony firms in Suharto's Indonesia, the family-owned personal networks in Thailand, the lack of financial sector reform today in Britain and the United States, or historically, the rise of the Rockefellers and Carnegies. They all relied on exclusive privileges in the railroad construction. So, if in the early stages of development, there was a strong, distinct overlap between economics and politics in the West, in other developing countries, what makes it bad here? Or what makes it different in the MENA region? And this is where I will end my presentation by exploring a few thoughts which researchers need to pay more attention in future. But before I do that, it's important to recognize a few theoretical inputs. The famous Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, who wrote a great deal about institutions, had this remarkable quote that in the early stages of capitalist development, all economic organizations are also political organizations, right? By the very nature of the economy at that stage. You have work by other political scientists like Stephen Haber, who talks about a commitment problem, right? And the commitment problem is that a lot of people who can invest in the economy, a lot of people who own assets, need protection from the government. And herein lies the dilemma, because those who can protect these assets can also expropriate them. So how do you seek that protection? The solution to that commitment problem could be cronyism, in which they provide binding, some kind of commitment to the regime, and this has been apparent in countries in Latin America. There's more recent work in development studies by North Vallis and Weingast that talks about how crony relations provide binding commitments for elites, right? In other words, as I showed you before, many of these crony relations generate incomes and unearned income streams, rents, that are used to sustain the ruling coalition. The moment they leave, it can have effects on political stability. Why are these rents harmful for development? Or are these rents necessarily harmful for development is a general question. And what is important, the global literature tells us that what is important is that the outcome of cronyism depends not much to who are the individuals or groups who get it, but the incentives and opportunities of those individuals who receive those rents. In other words, elite incentives become hugely important. What you find in industrial policy literature is that a lot of these rents were unproductive rents. These were rents that were generated for the spoilers. So we have heard a great deal about technological dynamism in Japan, but few people recognize that the Japanese LDP actually shared rents to these spoilers, because they thought that there is a technological game, there is an industrial strategy. Those who can spoil this game, you need to buy them off so that they stay on the sidelines. If you think about similar rent sharing arrangements between ruling families, civil servants, merchant capitalists, you have the ethnic Malays who sit on the boards of these companies controlled by Chinese. Again, they are bought off to ensure that they do not spoil the game. A lot of these transfers social scientists would call as cooperation contingent rents. These are rents that are contingent on them not spoiling the game. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this particular debate really depends on the underlying context. It depends on the types of cronies, the nature of activities they're engaged with, the nature of the growth cycle. If it's a low growth political economy, cronyism has very different effect. If it's a high growth political economy, cronyism has a very different effect. So the devil is really in the detail, and that leads me to the interests of these elites. And James Robinson has this great quote where he says, well, when industrialization succeeds, well, it depends on which interests are mobilized and what their interests are. And clearly, if you look at the Glorious Revolution in England, for example, the Whig coalition was the coalition that had a lot of members who had factories, who had direct stakes in the expansion of the productive enterprise. If you come to the Chinese Communist Party, again, it's a centralized regime, but it has created an incentive alignment between decentralized local actors whose interests were aligned with the expansion of the productive frontier. Turkey, yes, of course, the newspapers will tell us all bad stories about our party and Erdogan, and I'm sure there are a lot of problems. But if you take away and look just at objectively what's happening to the size distribution of firms, you see that in Turkey, a lot of these firms are the ones that were excluded before. So the new connected firms in Turkey are the ones that are small and medium enterprises that were excluded or that were failed to be born in the previous era, right, before Turgut Özal. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is that cronyism in its effect is partly determined by the nature of elite interests. After leaving this thought, I'm going to ask a few broader questions about how mena-cronyism might be different. Much of the analysis that will follow is not based on concrete empirical insights, but it's based on my own understanding of how MENA political economy is shaped. How is MENA different? How is the Middle East and North Africa region different? And I make 6 propositions. The first relates to exclusion. Any crony capitalist structure creates exclusion. If you are politically connected, you will exclude somebody, right? Somebody's got to be excluded. But the sheer scale of exclusion in Middle East and North Africa is mind-boggling, right? It's extreme risk aversion of the regimes to see any business that is independent that could form a political opposition in the future. There are very high barriers to entry in sectors that are rent thick. These are sectors where you could derive a lot of income, right? This could be telecommunication, real estate, banking, or other parts of the economy that are thick with rents. And in most cases, these barriers to entry are more political than economic. Because, when it comes to Middle Eastern countries, the regimes are extremely risk averse to see new forms of economic power emerging that could contest. And the logic that I find in my mind is one of partner and perish. The logic here is a binary logic. Either you get generous sticks or very deadly carrots, right? There could be expropriations. So if you look at, for example, in Saudi Arabia, WikiLeaks account how royal expropriations were very common. You look at Syria, if you ask a Syrian businessman, they would say, well, you're either with the Makhlouf, the president's cousin, or against the law, which means the law and its application is so wide that it could harm any business. So in this milieu, firms can grow up to a level, and beyond that, you have to either partner with one of the regime insiders, or you have to face extinction. So that logic, partner or perish, is not unique to the Middle East, but it certainly continues to persist far longer than it has persisted in many of the older Soviet Union, communist era republics. A third aspect relates to both history and dependence on external rents, which is differential bargaining strength. If you were to talk to a scholar in the United States about crony capitalism, they would talk about it as being part of a lobbying game, right? So politicians need to generate campaign finance, and businessmen need favors. There's a happy marriage. It's part of a lobbying game. It's part of some kind of bargaining. In the Middle East, we do not have genuinely independent bargaining structures, broadly speaking, when it comes to business-state relationship. And in many cases, the state has a decisive upper hand when it comes to dealing with the private sector. And in many cases, these cronies are themselves created through initiative of the political authority. There are often weak or non-existent bargaining structures. So that, I think, is an important aspect. And there are, Zingales in his recent paper in Journal of Economic Perspectives talked about a Goldilocks equilibrium, where there's a balance of power between the state and the business. And in every country, including in the present-day United States, there is cronyism, but there is that balance where the state has to balance the interests of society, balance the interests of the businessmen, and balance their own campaign finance instruments. And there's constant pressure from above and below. One of the key distinguishing features of the MENA region is that those pressures or that balance is very, very different, and it's certainly tilted against the private sector, not in its favor. He looks at different typologies, and certainly the MENA region falls in the first typology, where economic power emanates more from the political domain rather than vice versa. I'll finish very quickly. The fourth distinguishing factors is the elite incentives and state capacity. So while in East Asia and in Turkey, in many other cases, you have the elite is incentivized, or the Communist Party elite is incentivized to expand the productive frontier. We do not have exactly I cannot pass a general judgment about incentives, but we do find a pattern whereby the region inherited very weak business sector, very weak private sector. So essentially, we have in the region a very weak constituency for private sector development. And much of the population depended on public sector employment. They want to see money on the table. They're not interested in fighting for small and medium enterprises, right? And that's the sort of milieu where you do not have a private sector, a strong private sector, but neither do you have a strong constituency for private sector development. And in this milieu, cronyism is not linked to an explicit economic rationale, right? It's not linked with industrial policy. Another aspect which I feel is very apparent in after the period of economic liberalization is the erosion of state capacity. Bureaucracies in the Middle East were created for fundamentally different reasons. They were not created to promote industrial development, right? And over time, what we've seen is the liberalization reduce some regulatory barriers, but introduce other forms of regulations, which political scientists would call re-regulation. And my trade plot showed you how tariff barriers, falling tariff barriers, were compensated by growing reliance of non-tariff barriers. But importantly, it's not just the regulation, it's the discretionary use of regulation, which is very important. Because the private sector is always under the fear that there's some law under which they could be held to account. Okay, and that creates a sense of a sort of erosion of state capacity, which is very distinct in the MENA region, in my opinion. I've already talked about the very limited export orientation, right? In East Asia or Turkey, yes, there were crony firms, but imagine a firm in Suharto's Indonesia or Thailand under Tasksane. Many of these firms were inserted into regional trade networks. Yes, they received preferential treatment at home, but their connections with the global economy meant that they have to face some competition. They have to be productive. They have to generate jobs, right? And that's where Turkey is so different, because you see these kind of circular dots, these religious network firms, and then the pyramid secular network and the others in squares. You find all of these firms are increasing their export presence, but particularly the politically connected firms are predominantly in the export sector, right? Which again explains how cronyism becomes more consistent with growth in these contexts. A related idea on which I think a lot more work needs to be done is the nature of inter-firm linkages. It's possible that a crony firm gets a lot of favors and consolidates that power. Compare that to a situation where a crony firm accumulates a lot of privilege, but there is spillover to the rest of the economy. Think about BMW, not that it's a crony firm, but it's the sort of firm that has supplier contracts with a lot of small and medium enterprises. So when BMW sales go up, the rest of the economy benefits a great deal. And my sense is that in the MENA region, the nature of inter-firm linkages is very different. Inter-firm linkages are generally weak, which means that if you are connected, you have limited spillover to the rest of the economy. You have limited spillover to small and medium enterprises. Because yes, the crony firms of today can create the large unconnected firms of tomorrow if they have linkages with medium enterprises. And the final point is about the kind of mechanisms that are used in the MENA region to favor cronies. In many ways, the Middle East and North African countries rely on more distortionary instruments than the other part of the world. Subsidies, foreign exchange controls. I mean, if you think about Algeria today, it has a black market premium, right, which runs into double digits, right, which means the official exchange rate and the exchange rate in the market is very, very different. For an oil-rich country, this makes absolutely no sense. But of course, this is used to generate rents for different people. And those constituencies, but their overall impact on productivity, on growth, on job creation is far more than their beneficial impact for the regime. And many of these instruments have passed out of favor in other parts of the world, but they continue to persist in parts of the MENA region. As I said, there's a greater reliance on trade inhibiting non-tariff measures, tighter control of credit and land markets. So there are a lot of ways in which we can begin to see that the way in which business and politics overlaps in the Middle East and North Africa region is somewhat different, or there are certain important shades of difference with other regions. But as is always the case with any intellectual project, it creates often more questions than it answers, right? And we do create a lot of unanswered questions. For example, what is the nature of exchange, right? Of course, for example, in Assad, Syria, Rami Makhlouf was given favors, but he was the one who did not transmit his capital abroad. A lot of other merchants fled, he did not flee. He was the merchant who allowed the regime to bypass the sanctions, right? So there's a clear exchange, but still our knowledge of what precisely is the nature of exchange, we don't know much. We also don't know much about what is happening to non-crony firms. Yes, crony firms are everywhere in the world, but what's happening to non-crony firms, to the informal sector, to small and medium enterprises, to firms that fail to be born? Also, we need to have a better understanding of the nature of crony firms. You know, you might have a crony firm that dominates the whole market versus a situation where there are different crony firms and they're at least competing with each other. And in that process, they might generate benefits. So what's the nature of competition amongst these firms? How does cronyism link with the informal sector? These are all very open-ended questions. We don't know much about them. But I think my plea for the lecture today, and when I was presenting and giving this topic, many of my Egyptian friends said, oh, it's a very politically sensitive topic, don't talk about it. But as an economist, as a social scientist, I feel, and particularly my love for the region, my passion to study about the region, I feel it is important to look at these issues in an empirically verifiable way, in a objective, constructive, social scientific way that is beyond the logic of the street, beyond the logic of the state, and it's actually about the region as a whole, because I do sincerely believe that regimes come and go, businessmen come and go, the people are going to be here, and in 100 years' time, 200 years' time, ultimately we will also be talking about issues that connect the market and the state. You cannot disentangle the two. the overlap between business and politics, the overlap between market and state is going to remain there, because that's the stuff of political economy. And ultimately my effort was to generate that sort of empirical specificity in this hugely important debate, because I think the struggle for a new Middle East will ultimately be determined by this nature of interaction between the market and the state. And I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you very much, Adil, for the extremely interesting presentation and the very rich one. I'm quite familiar with your work and the work of Diwan as well. So, but still, like you don't fail to surprise me with like new findings and new ideas. So the floor is open. I prefer that we collect like 3 questions or so. So you can write them down and then we can like gain time. So, yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Adil, for the great presentation and welcome in Egypt. So I have a question regarding the exclusion part, which is basically, so which one occupy higher weight, the political weight or the economic weight? For instance, if we are talking about crony capitalist or politically connected firms in Egypt under Mubarak, most of them provided political support to the regime in order to ensure its durability, like controlling private media channels or running for parliamentary seats to control supermajority or other services like that. But on the other hand, the regime needed economic growth in order to ensure its own durability, especially that it's not a rentier regime in the common sense that we have in Gulf states, for instance. So those companies enable the regime to create economic growth, especially under Nazif government, but on the other hand, they provided political support. But which one is more important in that case? So here the exclusion part comes back in. So will I exclude a firm if it's economically important, but it's not providing political support, and I will provide the same opportunities to politically connected firms, even though they are not providing the same opportunities for economic growth? Or, well, it depends. So from the empirical cases you analyze, which one do you consider is more important for authoritarian regimes? Is it economic support or political support? That's it.
Thank you very much for this enlightening lecture. I did read the paper by Ishaq Diwan on crony capitalism in Egypt, and I liked it also very much. I have 2 questions. One about your statement that in the early phases of development, crony capitalism is inescapable, and you supported this by giving some examples of the United States, Carnegie, Rockefeller, etc. But my question is, in the case of Great Britain, the Industrial Revolution, my understanding is that at that time, capitalism was still competitive capitalism, was not monopoly capitalism. So there was a large number of small firms which, started the Industrial Revolution. It's very difficult for me to imagine that there was crony capitalism at this stage. So I would like you to clarify this statement. My second question is about, the difference between East Asia and the Middle East. I understand that General Park in South Korea required, used to meet, every month with heads of major companies and ask them to industrialize. And then they get, easy loans from South Korean banks. So he had the vision. He wanted to use these firms in order to push the process of industrialization in South Korea. In the Middle East, I think, in the case of Egypt, I know very well, I don't think there was any vision, to use these links in order to push the process of industrialization in Egypt. It was just, an attempt to get the political support from these large firms without any broad vision that they could be an instrument for continuing the process of industrialization. So my question is, how do you explain this difference between East Asia and the Middle East? Is it again a cultural difference or what? Okay, thank you.
Yes, it's just, that cronyism, as you said, is in the developed countries and developing countries. But my question is, what are the main features, what are the main differences between cronyism in the developed and in developing countries? Other point I want to raise is that is cronyism in developing countries does exist from the beginning. I mean, if you are a known politician or so on, from the beginning you have your enterprise and so on, as compared to the developed countries. cronyism exists when a certain enterprise proves to be successful, because it will make a difference. I mean, when it grows, and then here come the cronyism. It's different than from the start. At least in the other one, they will do something good to the economy at the beginning, and then here come cronyism. But I don't know, and that's why I want to ask you. I think cronyism in the developing countries is different. It starts from the beginning, and so its impact on the economy, I mean the impact of the project or the enterprise on the economy will be really much minimal than the developed countries. I will just your view on that.
Go ahead, please. Then we'll take another shot.
Very briefly, I think as social scientists, we know much less about this. So we have to admit right from the beginning, very humble disposition about the huge zone of ignorance. Some of the best scholars on the idea of a developmental state, what creates a developmental state, right? Essentially, most of the East Asian countries were developmental states that, as you mentioned, wanted to push for industrialization. I think some clue is found by some of my last slides about elite incentives. What are the elites motivated by, right? There's a very interesting book by Robert Bates, Prosperity and Violence, in which he talks about how those who have coercive power, those who control coercive power in a society, when they begin to shift their weight towards productive enterprises, right, that's when you develop, that's when the equilibrium begins to change. For example, fiscal capacity in Europe was created by those classes, those who had to engage in war, and it was by sheer survival, because elites would not expand the productive frontier just for nothing. It has to be compatible with their incentives, right? So I think the thread that connects three questions are elite incentives. Now, to start with the first question by Rania, yes, a typical political objective function would be one where you offer support to the cronies and get political support as in return, or you sacrifice growth. I think part of the difficulty in the MENA region is that there has not been a genuine need to give concessions to the private sector, because partly the region started off with very, very weak private sector. So you did not have a solid constituency for private sector development. Secondly, the region depends hugely on external rents, right? You don't need to give concessions to your own businessmen, because you have flows of rents coming through. Think about Turkey. Turkey's AK party and the growth of these small enterprises, it would have been impossible without the financial crisis of the late 1980s. Without the arrival of Turgut Özal, who leveled the playing field between small enterprises and large enterprises, and that kick-started growth. But why did he level the playing field? Because there was a crisis. In much of the MENA region, because of geopolitical compulsions, there's huge dependence on external rents, oil, aid, remittances, which means that you're not too worried about, and the private sector in any case doesn't really employ a large number of people for it to be significant. This is very different from many of the other places where you have to constantly negotiate, create bargaining structures, give concessions. This is how fiscal capacity developed in Europe, because the state was making war, it needed to raise finance. To raise finance, it had to tax the private sector, and the private sector said, well, okay, if you tax us, we will, we need to get some concessions out of you. This is how property rights developed in England. So that balance is very different here. So your question about early stage capitalism, yes, it has to be treated in a very, very careful way, because I don't want to send the impression as if, cronyism in early stages is always likely. What I'm going to say is that this connection between business and politics is always there. What is the nature of that connection? What broader purpose it is serving in the political economy is what matters. The fact that Carnegie's and Rockefellers got railroad contracts in the US, yes, but there were enough societal pressures to tie their hands later on, right? And therefore there was anti-competition law, anti-monopoly law, pro-competition legislation, which was very important. In the East Asian case too, I think the whole point about regional integration is very important, because if you are a Malaysian ruler or a Thai ruler or Philippines or any of these countries, yes, it's important for you to derive enough rents to distribute them to political cronies, but ultimately you're facing a growth frontier. You have to grow, otherwise you will not survive. And you are inserted in the regional supply chain. And I sometimes wished if there were a form of cronyism in the MENA region that creates a regionally integrated merchant class in the MENA region. Look at the situation today. I mean, you have in Tunisia, crony capitalist structures were thrown out, but did it create growth? No. One reason is that people who are protesting in Tunisia and people who could deliver in Tunisia, the government, both are helpless. If the government had an opportunity, they could protest against the people. It's just the people have opportunity. Same is the case in Jordan. You can change one government to the next government, but neither the protesters nor the government have genuine stake. To manage that sphere, you need a regionally integrated merchant class in the Arab world that has political voice, that gets benefit from the regimes, but has an interest in linking up Arab markets. Because it's through that regionally integrated merchant class that you could create a new economic and political order. Now, differences between developed and developing countries, my attempt in these slides was really to highlight some of those differences. And some of those differences are precisely in the domain of exclusion, this partner or parish logic, where you're either with makhluf or against the law. That, I think, has strong logic in the MENA region, much more than many other places in the world, which means there's no middle domain for you to operate. Right? You have to be under the radar screen, and that's my sense is that some of the firms in the MENA region are small, simply not because they cannot grow, simply to evade the radar screen of the state. They don't want to be noticed. They want to just operate as many small firms rather than a few large firms.
Okay. Please.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening and very stimulating. I have 3 questions. One has to do with the embodiment of this crony capitalism in the MENA region. And I'm going to zero in Egypt. During the Sadat and part of the Mubarak regime, there was always reference to الدولة العثمانية, and that was really in reference to a big contracting company called المقاولون العرب, which was owned by Osman Ahmed Osman. 10, 20 years later, we have an equivalent, something called الهيئة الهندسية, which is doing a lot of projects and getting a lot of contracts. And it's almost the equivalent of the الرأسمالية, except that this is very interesting because this is partly a state organization. It is a military organization. And I wonder if there's any equivalent with the army, either in Turkey or in Korea, had played such an important role in the economic takeoff, in industrialization, in modernization, in economic development in general. And if there is a difference, what's the difference? And how could we benefit from the dominance of such an institution?
Well, my question is very much connected to this question. It's about whether you did you consider the public-owned firms as politically connected firms in Egypt, whether they are part of the answers of the research. Are they considered politically connected firms? The other one is what is the date range of the research? From which date to which date?
So, just like this side and then that side. Just like shift.
I would like to ask two questions. The first one about the real impact on the economic growth, where economics were the main sectors like energy are not in the private sectors. It is in the state sectors. What effect of cronyism on these economies? The second one, the batteries of cronyism in the emerging markets countries, like the ones you sir mentioned, Turkey, Iran, Egypt, Tunisia. They have a different structure, politics. Like here in Egypt, they refer to some political influence in political families. They are persist in the parliament for consequences. Like many years, they have big influence on the economy, and they hold the largest stakes of it. What are the equivalent patterns in the other emerging markets countries?
Can you just repeat the last couple of sentences?
The first question regards the economic effect of the cronyism on the growth, where economies, big segments of it, like energy, is not in the private sectors, in the state sector, the public sectors. Public sector holds the large segments of segments that contributes large of the growth. Second one, the patterns of cronyism in different countries, like where it's parties, political parties, families, they are persistent in the regulation bodies like parliament for many years.
Thank you very much. Can I just abuse my position being the moderator? Yeah, we are collecting 3 questions and then he has to answer. So 3 questions and then 3 questions. So can I just pick up on this question, because some of the sectors that you showed with Diwan, like communications, energy sector, energy intensive industries, have a considerable presence of multinationals in the case of Egypt. So I can think of the cement or fertilizer sectors, for instance, as well as in the case of oil. You have all of these multinationals plus state-owned enterprises. So how do you control for these factors?
All very good questions. Look, I feel as a development economist that a lot of ideological emphasis was placed on the role of the state versus the role of the market in the 1980s. Because much of the literature coming out in the 1980s from the World Bank and other global institutions was suggestive of a more important role for the private sector. But what we have seen in many countries where electricity companies were broken up, where infrastructure companies were broken up, where key important state organs were broken up, you fragmented state capacity, but at the same time you also fragmented the market, right? In the sense that there were a lot of atomized agents and a few dominant firms. So we have to be careful when we draw this distinction between the state and the market, because there are certainly very important functions that these big organizations can play, right? These semi-public, these larger organizations. For example, in our Iranian chapter, there is example about some Iranian semi-public conglomerates which are innovating, which are not monopolizing opportunities, but actually engaging in creating some competition right? So there's certainly a lot more role for the state to play to coordinate different parts of the activity, where the private sector is unable to fill the role. And there's certainly that important role available for the state. Indeed, in China, you have these big firms that are private, but in many ways they receive support from the state. Same is true for Google and Apple. These are big companies, but they have immense leverage and voice in the national policy making. And they also pay taxes often. So it's not about public versus private. Yes, public sector corporations can play a very important role, right? But it all depends on what incentive structure exists. If you talk about the big public sector corporations in Turkey or in China, they are very clear. They are not just organizations where you distribute rents to elites that are connected to the government, right? Or bureaucratic elites. These are organizations where it's linked with clear performance, it's linked with a clear role, and the state uses these corporations to give them a level playing field to serve a coordinating function in the economy. Because in early stages of development, the state needs to coordinate different parts of the economy together. But can the MENA state play that role? I think our bureaucracy, particularly Egyptian bureaucracy, is several miles, 100 miles behind that objective, right? About the ability to create a well-functioning bureaucracy that is linked with that developmental objective. And I think this is certainly, it links up with your second question, definitely. It's the same idea, and in the terms of the time range of the research, it's basically late 1990s to 2011, the start of the Arab Spring period. So it doesn't cover the last kind of 10 years or so, but it focuses on the period of economic liberalization. I think your question about ethics, again, it links up with this public sector point, that there are certain sectors in which the state can benefit a great deal by creating their corporations. But I think one has to be very careful in this regard, because yes, let's say you have a state which gives contracts to a lot of public sector companies, and those public sector companies are not giving contracts to other firms. They are all monopolizing opportunity. It's very different from a state where the state is competing in those areas where it can give contracts to other firms, right? Where they can share the benefits. Or perhaps, for example, in China, I know in my own country, Pakistan, some of the military-owned firms, the Frontier Works Organization, for example, builds bridges and electricity plants in places where the private sector will not be able to do, such as the Northwest Frontier Province or places that are closer to the mountains. No private sector would operate there. So it really depends on the type and the particular situation. On multilateral presence, certainly, I think we haven't really touched this issue in great detail, but in many of the MENA contexts, cronyism is co-constituted. Remember the time when, around the period of economic liberalization, there were a lot of think tanks in Western countries, a lot of governments that were appreciating the process of economic reform without paying sufficient attention. And in fact, you know about the chambers of commerce and industry in these countries, the EU chambers of commerce and industry, the US chamber of commerce and industry. They were often controlled by people who were politically connected actors, right? We do also know that in North Africa, France has an important role. It has a key stake in the type of projects that it wins. So this external-internal dimension is extremely important. And clearly, in the era of globalization, quite a lot of large firms and large contracts are won by firms that are large international firms, but who have to partner with local regimes. And in some cases, it means they have to be less competitive. So if you look at the Danone, the public protest in Morocco against Danone, it was not a Moroccan-owned, purely Moroccan-owned firm, right? So in public imaginary as well, there is that overlap.
Thank you very much.
بس طبعا سعدت باللقاء، بس في حاجه مهمه، هو اللي زلنا بنتكلم في الادوات الاقتصاديه بالطريقه الكلاسيكيه، متناسين جزئيتين عنصرين مهمين جدا. العنصر الاول ان ما يسمى كلما زاد معدل الفساد في المجتمع.
بالراحه بقى كده عشان
كلما زاد معدل الفساد هناك علاقه بين ارتفاع معدل الفساد داخل المجتمع وبين انتشار المحسوبيه. اذا وبالتالي مدى مقدار استقلاليه القرار السياسي داخل الدوله وتبعيته لجهات او دول خارجيه، هو ده اللي بيحدد معيار المحسوبيه. لا توجد في الدول التابعه رأسمالية بالمفهوم الغربي او المفهوم الليبرالي الطبيعي، ولكن توجد هناك نوع من الحريه المقيده والتابعه بشكل او باخر للقرار السياسي. النقطه الثانيه،
لحظه واحده بس هترجم له اللي فات
الثاني.
So independent countries don't have the same pattern of capitalist evolution that exists in the West, and hence we have the corruption and cronyism as the typical features of this distorted form of capitalist. That was the first question, and then he will continue.
الجزئيه الثانيه متعلقه بعدم ادراك البحث من الناحيه العلميه وتجاهله او عدم تزامنه مع علاقه الزمن بالتكنولوجيا. في بحث انا عامله اللي هو نظريه التطور التكنولوجي وعلاقتها بمستوى السطو الزمن، ده اسقط كتير من المفاهيم الكلاسيكيه القديمه بما فيها مفهوم البحث بشكل عام، لان التكنولوجيا اختصرت الزمن، فالحدث اللي بياخد سنه زمان بياخد لحظه دلوقتي، فالمعلومه اصبحت تصل لرجل الشارع رئيس الجمهوريه ومحلله، وبالتالي قدره الحكومه او النظم السياسيه على الكذب بقت تقريبا شبه معدومه، وبالتالي ترتب على كده ان تم ابتكار اليات اقتصاديه مختلفه جدا. احنا ممكن نمول الدوله دلوقتي بزيرو فاينانس من غير فلوس خالص. اذا المشكله كلها ان الاليات اتغيرت والادوات اتغيرت، اذا اللي اصبح يحكم العمليه دلوقتي هو الزمن والتكنولوجي. فانا اعتقد ان البحث فيه جاب كبيره جدا في انه لم يتطرق لموضوع علاقه الزمن بالتكنولوجي، واستخدم البحث على ان الزمن كما هو متباطئ وان التكنولوجيا ثابته، وده اعتقد انه فيه جاب كبير جدا او فجوه كبيره جدا في البحث يجب ان تتدارك، لان كده يعتبر بحث اعتقد ان هو لو قيل في الستينات ما كانش هيختلف عن اتقال في 2018 او 2019. يبقى اذا فجوه التكنولوجيا وعلاقتها بالزمن اسقطت علاقه الزمن بالتكنولوجي او علاقه البحث او تزامن البحث مع التكنولوجيا او توافق مع التكنولوجيا، وبالتالي اعتقد الفجوه الزمنيه دي اثرت كتير على نتائج البحث.
شكرا. اوكي. دكتور جوده.
Thank you very much, Adil, for a thought-provoking presentation. I have one curious remark and then two questions. The curious remark is that to my best of knowledge, it was the World Bank who actually initiated work on crony capitalism. And I think also that the World Bank knew fully well from the very beginning that crony capitalism was there. Yet there is no eyebrow raised about it at all, and continued to play the game with the existing regimes until when those regimes collapsed, then they started raising the questions that were there for at least 20 or more than 20 years. This is the curious remark. The two questions are the following. One, I get the impression from parts of your presentation, Adil, that cronyism and crony capitalism is a bad word. It has negative consequences. In some places, it seems construed that it does have some benefits. And I'm wondering, what is the main message that you are sending across from this type of research? The other question is, I would like to know if you have studied, or any of these studies refer to, anything about the equity implications of crony capitalism, that is the implication in terms of social justice and income and wealth distribution in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Adil Bisham, Professor of Economics. I thank you for very hard work that was done, and as I see it, it is work out of it more specific studies would emerge. An important point to my mind is what was mentioned by Dr. Mustafa, I say it here, that capitalism, an important point is the role, although I'm a technical economist, is the role of history in all that, which doesn't appear in this paper. I mean, capitalism as it started, where you had to run fast in order to stand still, and real competition, it existed, and for many years, and it was by the sweat of thine brow thou shalt earn thy living, and so on. Then it developed, it moved until it became monopoly capitalism. People just think of Piketty because they don't read earlier books, Maurice Dobb, Paul Baran, and so on. And it became some kind of crony. The developing countries now, this is why history is so important. The developing countries, when they wake up, okay, some people say they wake up, there is technology, it can benefit them, but they wake up and then they see already that variant of capitalism, which is the crony capitalism. And the crony capitalism is not just the state and this corruption and so on. The Akerlof and the work by people like that, the crony capitalism is all these huge big corporations that really influence the individual, that tell you eat Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is not a chicken, by the way, and I can give you the link that it is not a chicken, and then or eat margarine for 30 years, and then they tell you no, margarine was wrong to eat, and so on. This is a kind of crony capitalism, not just the state. So there is this element. So the developing countries now, they wake up and they really begin, their starting point is this terrible point in the history of capitalism. The second thing I just want to mention is I very much like the very last sentence now I see in front of me. What is the role of the informal sector in the story of cronyism? I'm Egyptian. I'm a great believer in the informal sector in Egypt. It is what is keeping us Egyptians alive in this room now. It is not my salary, it is the informal sector, which, contrary to what De Soto says, should never be formalized, by the way. It's very efficient and wonderful. So this is something to be followed. And thirdly and lastly, you mentioned in your work about in the MENA region, I don't like aggregative approach. Each country is very different from the other country, by the way. You mentioned sort of integration of merchant, I don't know what. Merchants, leave them alone. Merchant capitalism is one kettle of fish, and industrial capitalism is another. Merchant capitalism is what Paul Baran used to call Kiko, quickly in, quickly out. Leave them, leave them totally out of the picture. This is how I feel about it. Thank you kindly.
معذرة ان انا هوجه السؤال باللغة العربية على افتراض ان الحكومة المصرية قررت ابتداء من عام 2020 انها تستخدم مبدأ الشفافية في التعامل مع المواطنين المصريين. ما هي 4 حاجات بس، انا عايز 4 بنود من حضرتك بس هتوضحهم لي. العقبات ما هم دقيقة واحدة، هم 4 نقط والله، في نقطة واحدة 4 حاجات. الأهمية، العقبات، المميزات، العيوب. 3 حاجة في رأي حضرتك الشخصي، هل مصر تقدر تستطيع انها تفعل ده من امتى؟ سنة كام؟ وشكرا. تفضل. شكرا.
Well, thank you very much for the tremendous interest generated. Look, let me admit very humbly that I chose a very important topic, and I displayed the impression as if I know everything about this subject. That is not true. I'm just a humble student of this very important subject, so I'm partly here to learn from your insights and questions. You are indeed right. There are lots of things that are missing from this study, and I hope that one day I could come and speak with you in Arabic here. I am learning Arabic. You talked about, sir, these time and technology and how those are bringing different changes. It's a vast subject. I'm not very fit to talk about that, but clearly, we have a few examples from history which tells us about the role of time and technology. In political economy, technology is hugely important. In this country, for example, under the Ottoman Empire, printing technology was banned. It was only allowed for Christians and Jews to publish in their because the state felt threatened from technology, because technology could democratize interpretation of religion, could democratize knowledge. You had, of course, now there's social media, you have big data, and big data creates big problems too. A lot of the data that we have today, my iPhone, the emails I'm sending, I'm not talking about Egypt. In Oxford, I don't feel safe because I don't have any privacy. I'm using credit cards, etc., etc. So data brings a lot of opportunities. For example, in a lot of countries, based on the biometric cards, you could do subsidy reforms, as in Egypt and other places. But they also create huge problems. So the thing I'm talking about is that technology creates opportunities and challenges. That's a lesson we learn from history. And second, time and technology might change, but asymmetric bargaining structures always remain. Power, right from times immemorial, has been asymmetrically distributed. Some people have more power than others. Some parts of the state have more power than others. Some states, like the US, Russia, others have more power than others. While all these shifts and changes will come through, the essential element of power will remain, and wherever power will remain, you can call it crony capitalism or whatever, you will have these questions. And again, I mean, if you look at the Financial Times selection of the best books in economics this year, 16 out of 20 books were on financial sector, and why capitalism failing in Europe and the US. Why is there so much inequality? So these are global concerns in many ways. Goda, thank you very much for coming to the seminar. I have learned a great deal from you in our previous interactions. What is the main message? I think the main message is, in one line, the devil is in the detail. We can talk about crony capitalism in very broad, generic terms, but we need to think about patterns of heterogeneity. We need to think about specificity. Who are the cronies? How do they compete with each other? What is the nature of exchange? What is the balance of social and economic interest and political interest in a society? Is cronyism part of a low-growth equilibrium or high-growth political economy? So when we think about a subject that is as charged as crony capitalism, we need to be careful about what we are talking about. And therefore, there is more need for fine-grained research, more data, more empirical methods. And there, if I could also respond to Adil's question about MENA states, absolutely. This study is about the Middle East, but if you read the introduction, it's all about how the context in these countries is different. In Lebanon and Iraq, cronyism is clientelism and corruption. And it is actually caused not by domestic actors, it's caused a lot more by global powers. You cannot understand corruption in Iraq if you do not understand the invasion of the United States in Iraq. Right? You cannot understand corruption in Iraq unless you think about the systematic fragmentation of the state that was wrought by this intervention. And the only thing that could result, as a result of that fragmentation of the state, is basically democratization of corruption and clientelism. Right? Similarly, if you want to understand clientelism and corruption in Lebanon, it's part of that confessional arrangement where each ethnic community or sectarian community is unable to think beyond their nose. This was very much part of the overall plan to do that, right? So clearly there are differences. Equity implications, yes, indeed there are. One equity implication is, of course, the creation of jobs. As I said, privileges are concentrated amongst the top firms. Employment is concentrated in the informal sector firms, right? Is this disjunction? There is also the disjunction between the shop and the street seller. Right? So there's a fixed cost of formality. Once you decide you are going to have an establishment, there are a lot of costs associated with it, whether it's bankruptcy, whether it's credit, etc., etc. So there is that element of justice involved in that as well. The other thing is about a second order impact on justice. Let's say if you have a model of development which is based on real estate development, which is based on finance, which is based on banking, telecom operation, I mean, it will create new pockets of wealth and influence, upper middle income classes. It will have impact on the nature of economic inequality, right? And ultimately, it's the task of economists to think about how that kind of service-led model of development generates particular types of opportunities and challenges. To your other questions about the role of big corporations, international organizations, look, as I said about asymmetric power structure, none of these are politically neutral organizations. If you think about the World Bank or the IMF as politically neutral, no, they are not. Because they have their own political economy. Right? And this political economy was revealed very recently on the naming of the president of the World Bank. There were some calls about developing country representation. So ultimately we are in the real world, we are living with these multinational organizations, global power structures, where power is manifested. And I think what is important for the social scientists is to recognize asymmetric power and to explore its impact on the way things are done. Because this is a missing elephant in the room, in a sense. To your question, sir, about transparency, I mean, at the end of the day, of course, if you're going to have, let's say, if I'm going to do a contract. So yes, transparency is a very important domain, but it's not a domain that could come through an executive decision. It's something that has built through constant struggles and tensions in society, right, as part of a very long process. Unfortunately, I cannot offer any more guidance on that subject, but I'm happy to engage further after the session. Well, thank you very much.